Tonight, we follow the life of a player who understood football not through movement, but through imagination. There are players who read the game as it unfolds. They track the ball, respond to pressure, cover the space they are given. They follow the logic the game presents to them. And then there are others, rare, a little apart from the rest, who seem to be processing something different entirely. Not the game as it is happening, but the game as it is about to happen. The moment before it happens. The pass that makes the next one possible. Guti was that second kind of player. He did not impose himself through pace or physicality. He did not dominate through relentless pressing or volume of touches. What he offered was quieter, and in its way, more unusual. He saw options that others could not identify. He chose passes that seemed, for a fraction of a second, to be heading in entirely the wrong direction, and then revealed themselves to be exactly right. He operated in spaces most players didn't even notice, and he found things there that most players simply walked past. That quality, the ability to see a solution before the problem had fully formed, is one of the most difficult things to teach. It is also one of the most difficult things to harness, even when you have it, because seeing something is one thing, doing it every time is another, and doing it consistently, in a team with specific demands and tactical structure, at one of the most scrutinized clubs in the world. That was never straightforward for him. His career at Real Madrid lasted 16 years. He made over 500 appearances. He wore the white shirt as a young player finding his way, and again as a senior figure, passing something forward. And even then, no one ever fully agreed on what he was. Starter, substitute, or something in between. That is where his story begins. José María Gutiérrez Hernández was born on the 31st of October, 1976, in Madrid. He grew up in the city he would later come to represent, which gave his relationship with Real Madrid a quality that went beyond professional attachment. He was a Madrileño playing for the city's club. That mattered to him. It mattered to the fans. And it added a particular layer of expectation to everything he did. And, in certain periods, everything he did not do. Madrid in the 1970s and 1980s was a city still finding its modern shape. Football was deeply embedded in daily life, particularly in the working-class neighborhoods, where the game functioned as a kind of common language. Boys played in the streets, in small parks, on whatever surface was available, and those who showed something recognizable, even at a young age, were found and brought into the organized youth structures that fed the bigger clubs. Guti showed that something early. He had the physical lightness that often accompanies technical players, the easy relationship with the ball that suggested he had been comfortable with it for as long as he could remember. But even then, what distinguished him was less technical than perceptual. He made decisions quickly. He looked where others were not looking. He found angles in small spaces. Real Madrid's youth academy, known as La Fábrica, had a long history of developing players who went on to represent the club at the highest level. It was a structured environment, technically demanding, designed to identify talent and give it the kind of formation that would allow it to survive the transition to professional football. Guti entered that system and progressed through it with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged there. He played as an attacking midfielder, a position that, at its best, requires both technical quality and a very particular kind of intelligence. The midfielder, who plays between the lines, who receives the ball in tight spaces and must immediately understand what to do with it, cannot rely purely on instinct. He must read the shape of the opposition, understand where his teammates are moving, and make decisions in a fraction of the time available to a winger or a striker. Guti was suited to this. The thinking part of the position came naturally to him. By his late teenage years, it was clear that something significant was developing. The question was not whether he had the quality. The question was how that quality would express itself at the highest level, under conditions that are designed in many ways to reduce improvisation and reward reliability. He joined the Real Madrid first team in the mid-1990s, entering a squad that was itself in a period of transition. The club had experienced years of domestic difficulty and was beginning to rebuild under a management structure that was increasingly focused on returning Real Madrid to European relevance. Guti arrived into this environment as a young player with a well-established reputation for creativity, but without the authority of an established starter. Breaking into a Real Madrid squad has never been straightforward for anyone. Even the most talented players have gone through periods of adjustment, of proving themselves within a competitive group, of waiting for opportunities. For Guti, this process was complicated by the specific nature of what he offered. His strengths were, in some senses, harder to evaluate than those of a more conventional midfielder. He did not offer the volume and energy of a box-to-box player. He did not offer the defensive discipline of a holding midfielder. What he offered was creative, intermittent, and sometimes spectacular, which made him valuable in certain moments and harder to justify in others. The managers he worked under in those early years responded to him differently. Some saw the talent and tried to find ways to integrate it into their systems. Others found his unpredictability difficult to manage within the structure they were trying to maintain. These early tensions between what Guti could do and what the team needed him to do were, in many respects, a preview of a tension that would follow him throughout his time at the club. He played. He contributed. There were moments, even in those early seasons, where he produced something that reminded everyone watching why he was there. A pass that split a defense open. A moment of control in a crowded midfield that created space where none appeared to exist. A decision made so quickly and accurately that the attacking move was already advancing before anyone had fully registered what had happened. But consistency was something else. The regularity with which he produced those moments fluctuated. There were matches where his influence was clear and cumulative, where he seemed to be pulling invisible strings across the pitch. And there were others where he drifted, where the connection between his vision and the physical expression of it seemed temporarily broken. These fluctuations were noted. They were discussed. And they shaped, over time, the way the club managed his role within the squad. As the 1990s moved toward the 2000s, Real Madrid began constructing something different. The arrival of a series of world-class signings, players of global stature and commercial appeal, changed the nature of the squad entirely. By the early 2000s, the group that assembled in Madrid included Zinedine Zidane, Luis Figo, Ronaldo, and later, David Beckham. They were not just great players, they were global stars. Guti was already at the club when this era began. He watched it arrive, and then found himself navigating it from within. His position in the squad did not diminish in any formal sense. He continued to train at the highest level, to be part of the group, to feature in matches. But the nature of his role shifted. There were now players around him who operated in similar areas of the pitch, with different levels of guaranteed authority. Finding space, not just physical space on the pitch, but space in the tactical and psychological sense, required something additional. What is perhaps most striking about Guti's position during the Galacticos era is that it did not erase his influence. He continued to matter in matches. His ability to change the flow of a game did not disappear simply because the names around him were larger. When he entered matches, often as a substitute, given the competition for places, the effect was noticeable. The passing lanes through which he operated were different from those his teammates used. He offered something that even Zidane and Figo, with all their quality, did not precisely replicate. Zidane, for example, was a player of enormous control and elegance. He received the ball and almost always made the right decision. Often the safe and correct decision, the one that kept possession and advanced the play. Yes, his vision was wide, but always controlled. Guti's vision was different in its expression. He was more likely to attempt something that carried higher risk, a pass into a space that existed only for a moment, a no-look decision made before his body had committed to its position. This distinction is not a judgment about which was better. Zidane was, across the full range of his qualities, a more complete player by any measure of consistency. But Guti offered something specific that even Zidane did not: the capacity for sudden, unexpected improvisation. The pass that no one anticipated, including sometimes the player receiving it. His backheel passes became something of a signature. The backheel in football carries a certain risk. It is a pass made without the full visual information available to a forward-facing player. It relies on peripheral awareness, on body feel, on a kind of internal map of where teammates and opponents are positioned. When it works, it can split a defensive line in a way that no other type of pass quite manages. When it does not work, it looks like exactly what it is: an attempt to do something clever that wasn't quite justified. Guti's backheel moments were both celebrated and used as evidence. The same action, a pass played behind him without looking, could be described as evidence of extraordinary instinct or evidence of unnecessary extravagance, depending on the observer. That duality followed him throughout his career, and it tells us something about how creativity is evaluated in football. One of the most documented moments in his career came in a match against Deportivo de La Coruña. The precise geometry of what happened, the angle of the ball, the position of the attacker, the fact that the decision was made in a compressed moment under pressure, turned it into something that was replayed and discussed for years afterward. It was not simply a good pass. It was a pass that should not have worked, but did. A pass that most players would not have chosen to attempt, and fewer still would have been able to execute. That moment, more than any sustained run of form, became the shorthand for what he was. The interesting thing about moments like that is what they reveal about the player who produces them. They are not planned. They cannot be trained in the conventional sense. What can be trained is the technical preparation, the touch, the weight, the spatial awareness. But the decision to attempt the pass in the first place comes from something else. It comes from a reading of the game that identified, in that fraction of a second, a possibility that the situation contained. Guti identified it. He acted on it. And then the moment passed, and the game moved on. This quality, identifying the hidden possibility in a given moment, was also visible in how he operated between phases of play. Where some midfielders are most dangerous in transition or in sustained possession sequences, Guti was capable of arriving in unexpected places. He would appear in a pocket of space that had only just opened, receive a pass, and immediately release the ball in a direction that the defensive structure had not yet accounted for. He was, in this sense, exploiting lag, the small delay between what a defense sees and what it responds to. His no-look decisions were part of the same quality. By the time Guti had received the ball and decided what to do, he had already processed the positions of the players around him. The look, the turning of the head toward the target, would have given away his intention and allowed the defense an extra fraction of a second to close the space. By not looking, he preserved that fraction. The ball arrived before the defensive adjustment. None of this is to suggest that he played in a purely abstract, intellectual way. Football is a physical game, and his physical engagement with it was real and sometimes intense. But his effect on a match was rarely primarily physical. It was primarily informational. He changed what the attacking players around him knew, and therefore what they could do. Vicente del Bosque, who managed Real Madrid during a significant portion of this period, had a particular relationship with Guti. Del Bosque was a manager who valued technical quality and who was, in general, less rigid in his tactical demands than some of his predecessors and successors at the club. Within his system, Guti found more opportunity than he had under certain other managers. Del Bosque trusted him with minutes, sometimes significant minutes, and there were periods under his management where Guti's influence on the team's attacking play was genuinely central. The trust was not unconditional. Del Bosque was managing a team of enormous egos and complex dynamics, and the decisions about who played and for how long were always filtered through considerations beyond pure technical quality. But the fact that he consistently gave Guti space within his squads, that he included him in important matches and in key European nights, suggests that he saw something reliable enough in him to justify that investment. Fabio Capello represented a different kind of management relationship. Capello's approach to football was structured, tactically specific, and demanding in terms of defensive discipline and collective organization. He expected his players to fulfill specific roles within a defined system, and the margin he allowed for individual expression was narrower than Del Bosque's. Within that context, a player like Guti, whose strengths were most visible when he had freedom to improvise, to take risks, to make decisions that went beyond the tactical plan, was inevitably more constrained. The relationship between Capello and Guti was, by various accounts, complex. There were periods where Capello used him, and periods where he clearly did not trust him sufficiently to give him meaningful minutes. This was not simply a personality conflict, though tensions of that kind are documented in football management relationships generally. It was more fundamentally a question of fit. What Guti offered was not always what Capello's systems needed, and in those systems, the players who benefited most were those whose strengths aligned with the structure's demands. What teammates said about Guti over many years tended to cluster around a few consistent ideas. His vision was frequently mentioned, not just his technical passing ability, but the anticipatory quality of his thinking. Players described experiencing his passes as arriving before they had quite finished making their run, which is itself a form of compliment. It means the pass was read not just correctly, but early. It means the passer knew where the run was going before it had fully developed. Raul, who played alongside him for many years, was one of several players who spoke about the particular quality Guti brought to the attack. Raul was himself a player of very high intelligence, a forward who moved with enormous precision, and who understood, perhaps better than almost anyone, how to position himself in relation to a pass. For him to note Guti's creativity specifically suggests that what he offered was genuinely different from what other midfielders in that squad were providing. Roberto Carlos, another long-serving teammate, was someone who benefited directly from Guti's ability to read attacking movement along the left side of the pitch. The connection between an overlapping left-back and a creative midfielder requires a shared spatial understanding. The midfielder must see the run beginning and release the ball into the right channel before the back has arrived there. Guti managed this kind of connection with a frequency that was notable. His personality existed in a different register from his playing style, though the two were not unrelated. He was not a quiet or reserved presence in the dressing room. He was, by various accounts, direct, sometimes combative, and prone to emotional expression in both directions, capable of warmth and loyalty toward teammates, and equally capable of frustration and conflict when situations did not align with his own sense of how things should be. There were disciplinary incidents over the years, moments where his emotional state crossed into action that required formal response. These were not fabricated or exaggerated. They were documented parts of a career that included, alongside all the technical brilliance, a personality that was not always managed with the kind of coolness that top-level professional environments tend to reward. What is interesting about this is that it was not entirely separate from his playing style. The same capacity for improvisation that made his passing so distinctive, the willingness to attempt something unexpected, to trust an instinct rather than follow the safer option, also expressed itself in his personal conduct. He was not someone who suppressed impulse particularly well, whether the impulse was a brilliant backheel or a public expression of frustration. This is not uncommon in players of his type. There is something about genuine creative ability in football, the willingness to see outside the structured options, that often coexists with a certain psychological intensity. The player who trusts his instincts enough to attempt the unlikely pass must also trust himself in other situations, and that self-trust can tip, under pressure, into something less controlled. The question of why he never became a guaranteed starter, a question that hung over his career without being fully answered, cannot be reduced to any single factor. It was not simply his inconsistency. It was not simply personality. It was not simply the Galacticos and the competition they created. It was all of these things interacting with each other within an environment that had very specific demands and very little tolerance for underperformance. Real Madrid, during those years, was not just a football club in the conventional sense. It was a global organization with commercial and sporting goals that were intertwined in complex ways. The players who wore the shirt were simultaneously athletes and representatives of an identity. The pressure this created was enormous and largely invisible to those outside it. How a player responded to that pressure, how they managed the gap between expectation and reality, determined more than almost anything else what kind of career they had. Guti managed it in his own way. He stayed. For 16 years, he remained at a club that was not always easy for him, that sometimes marginalized him, that changed around him in ways he could not control. The loyalty involved in that, the decision, repeated year after year to remain, is not always acknowledged in the broader story of his career. But it is part of the story. There were seasons where his involvement was considerable. There were others where he featured less frequently, where he watched from positions, the bench, the stands, that most players would find difficult to accept. He accepted them. He continued to prepare, to train, to be available. And when opportunities came, he produced moments that justified his presence. The transition into a senior role, the shift from young player to experienced squad member to something approaching a quiet leader, happened gradually over the second half of his time at Real Madrid. By the time he was in his early 30s, he was no longer the young talent whose potential was being debated. He was someone who had been through the Galacticos era, through multiple managerial changes, through European campaigns and domestic title races, and had come out the other side with both his quality and his reputation intact. That experience carries its own kind of value. Younger players arriving at the club were entering an environment that Guti had already navigated at every level. He understood what the demands were. He understood what the pressure felt like from the inside. He understood, more specifically, what it meant to play in a Real Madrid shirt in a Champions League knockout match, when the stadium is full and the margins are extremely small. His influence in that later phase was expressed differently from how he had operated at the peak of his attacking contribution. He was no longer the player who was going to single-handedly change a match with a brilliant piece of improvisation, or at least not primarily that player. He was someone who provided context, who offered younger players the benefit of long experience, who contributed to the culture of preparation and seriousness that distinguishes the top clubs from those below them. When he finally left Real Madrid in 2010, it marked the end of an association that had lasted from childhood. The departure was quiet by the standards of some of the transfers that had defined the Galacticos era. There was no enormous transfer fee, no global press conference. He simply moved on to Beşiktaş in Turkey, a club and a football culture that was significantly different from what he had known. The move to Beşiktaş was, in some respects, a recalibration. He arrived in Istanbul as a player of established reputation, but at a stage of his career where the physical demands of top-level football were naturally beginning to narrow the options available to him. Beşiktaş was a club with its own history and its own passionate support, but it operated at a different level of competition and intensity than the one he had spent his entire career in. What was notable about his time there was the degree to which his creative qualities remained visible, even in this new context. Players of genuine technical intelligence tend to adapt better to different environments than those whose effectiveness depends primarily on physical attributes. Guti's ability to read the game, to find passing lanes, to make decisions in compressed spaces, these did not diminish simply because the setting had changed. They expressed themselves within a different framework, against different opponents, in a city that received them with its own particular enthusiasm. The fans in Istanbul responded to him. There is something about creative players, about players who do things with the ball that are unexpected and beautiful, that crosses cultural boundaries in football. A brilliant pass is recognizable as such, whether you are watching in Madrid or Istanbul or anywhere else. Guti gave Beşiktaş supporters moments of that kind, and they appreciated them. His career concluded without the championship-winning finale that forms the tidy ending of some players' stories. It ended, as most careers do, more quietly than it had begun. The accumulated years of high-level competition take their toll, and the decision to stop, or the moment when the decision becomes unavoidable, arrives with a combination of physical reality and a kind of internal recognition that the time has come. The question of his Spain career runs through his story in a different way. He represented Spain at youth level and was always considered part of the generation that included players like Xavi, Iniesta, Raúl, Fernando Torres, and others who would go on to achieve the most successful period in Spanish football history. That generation, the one that won Euro 2008, the 2010 World Cup, and Euro 2012, transformed Spanish football's global standing. It remains, by many measures, the most successful national team of its era. Guti was on the periphery of this story. He was included in squads at various points. He was considered and reconsidered, but he never established himself as a regular starter or a key player in the way that some of his contemporaries did. The reasons for this are multiple. The competition within that generation was extraordinary. To be considered for starting positions in that group required qualities of consistency and tactical adaptability that Guti possessed only partially. The Spain team of that era was built on a very specific idea of football. It required high pressing, constant movement off the ball, and a willingness to operate within a tightly organized collective system, where individual expression was channeled through shared principles. Xavi and Iniesta, the midfielders who defined that era's central structure, were both players of enormous technical quality, but their quality expressed itself within the system rather than outside it. They were creative in the sense that they found solutions, but solutions that the system generated, that the pressing and movement created. Guti's creativity was more individual and more speculative. He generated solutions from within his own reading of the situation, sometimes independently of what the collective structure was providing. That is not worse. It is simply different, and it was less aligned with what the Spain national team of that era was asking its midfielders to do. This may be the clearest expression of the tension that ran through his entire career. His talent was real. The moments he produced were, in their own way, irreplaceable. No one else was producing quite those moments, in quite that way, during the years he played. But football, at the highest level, is a collective game, and the collective frameworks that produce success in the modern era have specific requirements. Guti's gifts aligned with some of those requirements, and not with others. What he could do, the vision, the touch, the decision-making in tight spaces, was always something that coaches and teammates admired, sometimes openly, sometimes with the kind of quieter admiration that does not easily translate into guaranteed playing time. The admiration was real. The recognition was real. The difficulty of fully incorporating his style into the structures that modern football demands was also real. In the history of football, there is a certain type of player who exists slightly outside the dominant narrative of their era. They are not failures. Their careers are too long and too filled with genuine contribution for that word to apply. But they are also not quite what the stories of their time most easily accommodate. They are players whose qualities were appreciated in moments, celebrated in individual instances, but never quite harnessed in the sustained, systematic way that produces the clean career arcs of the sport's most celebrated names. Guti belongs to that category. His career at Real Madrid was long enough and significant enough to resist easy summarization. He played in European finals. He was part of title-winning squads. He contributed, across hundreds of appearances, to the ongoing story of one of the world's most demanding football clubs. He did all of this while being, for much of the time, something other than a guaranteed starter, a player who offered something genuine and distinctive and irreplaceable, but who also offered something that was difficult to depend on in the way that the highest level football environment requires. The training ground stories that circulated about him over the years, the anecdotes shared by coaches and teammates about what he produced in sessions. When the pressure of the match environment was removed and the space for experimentation was wider, paint a picture of someone who was even more freely creative away from the formal demands of competition. In training, the combinations he attempted, the ideas he tested, were a version of what he showed in matches, but less filtered by the awareness of consequence. Players who worked alongside him in those sessions described something recognizable. A player who was thinking about the game in a particular way, who was always looking for what was not obvious, who seemed almost restless with the more straightforward options. This quality was visible in matches too, but in training, it was more unguarded. The relationship between a creative player and a training environment is not always easy to manage from a coaching perspective. What works in training, the experimental pass, the unexpected combination, needs to be filtered against what is likely to work in competition. A manager watching training sessions must constantly evaluate which of a player's instincts to encourage and which to gently redirect. With Guti, that evaluation was never simple, because the truth is that some of his most apparently extravagant instincts were correct. The pass that looked unlikely in the training ground session was sometimes the same pass that changed a Champions League knockout match. The tendency to attempt the unexpected was not simply self-expression. It was, at its best, a genuine reading of possibility, a recognition that the situation contained an option that the obvious, safe choice would not reveal. This is ultimately what made him so difficult to categorize. He was not simply a player who took unnecessary risks. He was a player whose assessment of risk was different from most people's assessment of risk, because his assessment was informed by a perception of the game's possibilities that was not available to most people. When he attempted the backheel, he was not ignoring the risk. He was, in his own reading of the situation, calculating that the risk was justified by the possibility. He was sometimes wrong, but he was also, at certain crucial moments, very specifically right. The broader story of his career, the 16 years at Real Madrid, the managers he worked under, the teammates alongside whom he played, the matches in which he appeared and the matches in which he did not, is in one sense the story of a very gifted player navigating a very demanding environment over a long period of time. But it is also something else. It is the story of a particular kind of football intelligence encountering a particular kind of institutional structure, and the two finding ways to coexist that were neither fully satisfying nor fully limiting for either party. Real Madrid got 16 years of a player who could change a game's direction from a standing start, who offered something in attacking phases that no other player in the squad quite replicated, who understood the specific culture of the club from childhood and embodied it in a particular way. And Guti got 16 years at the club where he had grown up, playing alongside some of the finest footballers of his generation, in competitions and stadiums that represented the highest level the sport offers. That coexistence, imperfect, sometimes frustrating, occasionally spectacular, is the essential substance of his career. It does not resolve into a single clean narrative. It does not offer the simple arc of a player who dominated his era or of one who failed to achieve his potential. It sits somewhere more complicated and more human than either of those options. What Guti saw, in those moments when his reading of the game produced something unexpected and precise, was something private. It was a version of the situation that only he was experiencing. The pass he chose was the pass that his perception made available to him. And in those moments, the perception was correct, and the pass arrived, and the game shifted in the small but definite way that a great creative decision can shift a game. Those moments accumulated over time into something that his teammates and opponents and coaches recognized, even when they found it difficult to describe precisely. He was different, not in a way that made him the best player in every match, not in a way that made him indispensable in the conventional sense, but in a way that was recognizable and real. The way that genuine individual quality, operating within its own logic, is always recognizable to those who are paying close enough attention. The game he saw, slightly ahead of the one being played, slightly outside the structure others were working within, was not always the game that the coaching staff needed him to play, but it was always, unmistakably, his. There is a particular kind of player who becomes clearer in memory than they ever quite were in the moment. While they are playing, the debate around them never fully settles. The question of whether they are doing enough, whether they are being used correctly, whether the team would be better served by someone more predictable, that question stays open. And then, when the career ends and the noise quiets, something shifts. What remains is not the debate. What remains is the image of a specific kind of quality, seen clearly now that there is no longer any argument to be had about it. Guti is that kind of player for many who watched him closely. In the years after his retirement, those who played alongside him have spoken about him with a consistency that is itself revealing. Not with the kind of superlatives that attach to the very greatest players, the ones whose careers resolve themselves into trophies and records and moments of undeniable collective triumph, but with something quieter and, in its way, more specific. They speak about what it felt like to play with him, the experience of being a teammate, of receiving his passes, of understanding over time the particular logic he brought to each match. And what they describe, repeatedly, is a kind of surprise. Not the surprise of the unexpected, though there was plenty of that, but a deeper surprise. The surprise of realizing, after the pass had arrived, that it was exactly what the situation had required, that the decision he had made, which had seemed in the fraction of a second before it happened to be unusual, was in retrospect the most precise possible response to what the game was offering. That kind of surprise is rare. It requires a player whose reading of the situation is operating at a level that others around him are not quite reaching, even when those others are themselves very good players. It requires someone who is not simply responding to the game, but anticipating it, processing what is about to happen rather than what is happening now. He was not always easy to play with, in the sense that he required a certain kind of attentiveness from those around him. His passes sometimes arrived in places that the receiving player had not yet fully committed to going. The run was still forming. The space was only beginning to open, and the ball was already there, placed with enough care to be useful but demanding something from the receiver. A decision, a sharpness, a willingness to trust what had been given to them. Players who were well suited to receiving his passes tended to share a quality of their own. They moved early. They committed to spaces before those spaces were fully available. They were, in their own way, anticipating the game rather than waiting for it to develop. When that kind of forward movement connected with Guti's forward thinking, the combinations that resulted could be very difficult to defend against, not because they were physically overwhelming, but because they were temporally advanced. Because by the time the defensive structure registered what was happening, the decision had already been made, and the ball was already moving. This is a less visible quality than pace or strength, and it is harder to demonstrate in statistics or highlight packages. The pass that arrives fractionally early, the movement that begins before the ball is released. These are things that require context to appreciate. They require knowing what the other options were, understanding why a different decision would have been slower or more predictable, recognizing the specific geometry of what was created. Those who watched him closely over many seasons developed that context gradually. They learned to read his intentions before he acted on them, not because he was obvious, but because they had seen enough of his choices to begin understanding the logic beneath them. Opposing defenders occasionally describe the same thing from the other direction. The difficulty of reading him, the particular kind of problem he created, which was not the problem of direct speed or power, but the problem of decision-making that was slightly ahead of where they had positioned themselves to respond. When he received the ball in a half space, the area between a fullback and a centre-back, between the lines of midfield and defence, his first touch was rarely dramatic. It was quiet and controlled, and it moved the ball just enough to open the angle he needed. That small movement, a few inches in the right direction, was where much of his value was concentrated. It created the passing option that had not existed a moment before. And then, from that adjusted position, he would release the ball into a channel, or to a runner that the defensive shape had not yet closed. The economy of it was part of what made it effective. He did not need large amounts of space. He did not need long runs or extended build-up sequences. He needed a moment, a brief window in which the defensive organization had a gap, however small. And within that window, he could do something that changed the direction of the attack. In his later years at Real Madrid, as the squad continued to evolve and the players around him changed, this quality remained. It had always been the most durable part of what he offered, because it did not depend on physical attributes that decline with age. Vision does not diminish the way pace does. The ability to read the game, to identify the space before it appears, to make decisions quickly and accurately. These things can be maintained, and in some players they deepen with experience, because the accumulated knowledge of thousands of matches adds layers of recognition that a younger player simply has not yet built. There were younger players at the club during his final seasons who later spoke about what it had meant to train alongside him. Not in grand terms, but in specific ones. The way a certain kind of pass, seen in training, reframed what they thought was possible in a given situation. The moment of watching him receive the ball in a tight space and release it without hesitation, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the hesitation they themselves felt in that situation was not inevitable, that it was possible to see clearly enough, early enough, to act without pausing. That kind of influence is quiet and indirect, and it rarely appears in any official account of a player's career. But it is real, and it moves forward in time through the players who absorbed it. Some quality of what Guti understood about the game was passed along in those training sessions, in those moments of watching and absorbing, and it continued to exist in the players who received it long after his career had ended. When he left football entirely, the game he had played it for so long, the internal game of reading and anticipating and finding the option that others had not yet seen, did not simply stop. It became something else. The knowledge remained. The habits of perception that had been built over decades of professional football do not disappear when the boots come off. They become part of how a person sees things, how they process situations, how they move through the world. What he left behind in football is not easily measured. The trophies he was part of winning are documented. The appearances are recorded. The goals and assists exist in the archive of the competition. But the subtler things, the passes that opened games, the combinations that created chances which were then missed, the moments where his influence was real but not traceable to a single statistic, those exist only in the memories of the people who were there. And those memories are, in their own way, very clear. A player who did not follow the rhythm of the game, but instead reshaped it, briefly, in moments only he could see. The pass is slow. The movement softens. And what remains is the memory of something unexpected. Let the quiet settle now. There is nothing left to follow, nothing left to work out. Only the long, slow drift of an evening coming to its end. And somewhere in the distance, the last trace of a game being played in a way that only one person fully understood. Good night.